Grandmother slipped an envelope into my coat pocket at the hospital the winter I turned 15, right before the nurses came to tell us it was time to say goodbye. She made me promise not to open it until I had built something that belonged only to me, something no one could reach in and take. I didn't fully understand what she meant then. I do now. My father's name is Gordon Whitfield. For 32 years, he ran Whitfield Mechanical Services out of Sudbury, Ontario, commercial HVAC installation and industrial maintenance contracts across the Nickel Belt. He built it from a single work van and a tool belt in the back of a pickup truck. By the time I was in high school, the company had 47 employees and a provincial safety award plaque bolted to the reception wall. It was the kind of business that kept the heat running in hospital wings and the ventilation working in mining facilities. Functional, unglamorous, genuinely essential. And he managed it the way he managed every room he walked into, with total, unquestioned authority. My older brother, Colin, was the company's future. He knew it and wore it comfortably, the way you wear a jacket that was tailored for you. By 24, he had his millwright certification, his project management credentials, and a seat at the weekly ops table. He spoke the language of margins and crew scheduling. He was the plan. I was the variable that didn't fit the equation. I drew, constantly, obsessively, in every notebook and on every surface my parents would tolerate. Not doodles. Proper work. Architectural interiors, textile patterns, furniture concepts I'd sketch out in the margins of my math homework and then redraw properly on graph paper at home. When I was 16, my art teacher, Mrs. Pack, Cower, stayed after class one Thursday to tell me that what I was doing wasn't just good for my age. She said it was just good. Full stop. She asked if I had thought about applying to design programs. I had thought about almost nothing else. My father's view of art was precise and consistent. It was a hobby. A nice one maybe, but structurally irrelevant to a life that needed to pay for itself. He had built something real with his hands and his mind, and the business was there, waiting, like an inheritance that had already been earned on my behalf. All I had to do was step into it. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Sunday evening in March, 2 months before I finished grade 12. I had been accepted to OCAD University in Toronto, the Ontario College of Art and Design. Not a conditional acceptance. A direct full program offer with a merit scholarship that covered 60% of my tuition. The letter came with a note from the admissions coordinator who had reviewed my portfolio submission. She said my textile design concepts showed an unusual integration of structural thinking and visual instinct. I set the acceptance letter on the kitchen table next to my father's coffee while he was reading the Sunday paper. I laid out 6 drawings around it, the portfolio pieces I had submitted, the ones I was proudest of. I stood in the doorway. He read the letter. Slowly, he set it down and looked at the drawings for a long moment. Then he folded the letter back into its envelope, set it on top of the drawings, and told me OCAD was a fine school for people who wanted to teach art classes. He told me Toronto was expensive and unstable and that I was standing in front of a future that most people would spend their careers trying to build. He told me Whitfield Mechanical had a junior estimating role that Colin had already said he'd help me learn. He told me design was something I could do on weekends. I told him I was going. He looked at me the way he looked at a subcontractor who'd missed a deadline. Not with anger exactly. With a kind of cold, methodical disappointment that was somehow worse. He told me that if I walked away from the family business to chase what he called a drawing degree, I was on my own. No top-up on the scholarship. No help with rent in Toronto. No safety net. The door to Whitfield Mechanical would remain open because he wasn't a vindictive man, but the financial support structure, the plan he had built around me, would be withdrawn. Entirely. I told him the scholarship covered enough. He picked up the 6 drawings I had laid out on the table. He didn't crumple them. He didn't tear them. He walked to the recycling bin under the kitchen counter, lifted the lid, and placed them inside with the same flat efficiency he used when filing paperwork that had outlived its purpose. He told me that creative careers were for people without better options. That I had better options. That I was making a sentimental decision, and I would understand that in 5 years. Then he picked up his coffee and his newspaper and went to his chair in the living room. He didn't look back. I went upstairs. I sat on my bed for a long time without moving. Then I opened my closet and pulled out the duffel bag I used for school trips. I packed what mattered: my sketchbooks, my good pencil set, my grandmother's old film camera that she'd given me at Christmas the year before she died. I opened the envelope she had pressed into my coat pocket at the hospital. Inside was a card with her handwriting. It said TD Bank, branch 0592, account ending 3847. The password is your middle name spelled backwards. You were never the variable, Ren. You were always the point. Go. My middle name is Eleanor. Backwards is Rowanol. I sat with that card in my hands for a very long time. My grandmother, Bet, had been depositing money into that account since I was 11 years old. She had done it quietly, methodically, the way she did most things, without announcement, without expectation of credit. When I walked into the TD branch on Elm Street the following Monday morning, the balance was $11,400. She had never once mentioned it. Not on birthdays, not during our Sunday afternoon calls where she asked me to describe whatever I was drawing. The way other grandmothers asked about friends and boys. I sat in my car in the TD parking lot for 25 minutes before I could drive home. I didn't touch that money for comfort. I treated it like structural capital. My grandmother had built it for a purpose, and I wasn't going to spend it on things that felt good in the moment. I used a portion of it to cover the deposit on a shared student house near Dufferin Street. 3 other students, 1 bathroom radiators that clanged all winter. I used another portion to buy a used drafting table from a Kijiji listing in Etobicoke, and a proper light box that I carried home on the TTC in 2 trips. OCAD was difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated and necessary in ways I couldn't have imagined. The program pushed me past the safe edges of what I already knew how to do. In my second year, I started developing a textile design system I called Fenberg, named for the creek behind my grandmother's house in Lively, the one that ran copper brown in October from the tannins and the fallen leaves. The name felt right. Specific. A little obscure. Exactly mine. I started selling Fenberg prints during an Etsy shop in my 3rd year. The first month I made $87. I reinvested all of it. By my final semester, I had a waiting list of 60 people and a small wholesale inquiry from a home goods boutique on Queen Street West. I graduated with distinction. I did not invite my father. I did not invite Colin. I went to convocation alone, took a photo of myself from my gown outside the OCAD building with my grandmother's film camera on a self-timer, and had dinner with my roommate Paige and her parents at a Portuguese restaurant on Dundas. Paige's mother hugged me and asked where my family was. I said they couldn't make it. She hugged me again, harder, and that was enough. The years after graduation were not a highlight reel. They were early mornings and long invoicing sessions and the particular anxiety of watching your bank account drain in October when wholesale orders slow down before the holiday rush kicks in. I moved from Toronto to Hamilton because the studio rents made actual sense there and because the creative community in the lower city was alive in a way that felt real rather than curated. I signed a lease on a second-floor studio space on James Street North. The floors were uneven. The windows were original to the building and let in cold air around the frames from November through March. I bought foam weather stripping in bulk from Home Hardware and installed it myself over a single determined Saturday. I brought on my first part-time help in my second year in Hamilton, a woman named Iris who had left a corporate communications job and needed to do something with her hands. She came in 3 days a week and handled the shop fulfillment and wholesale correspondence. She showed up every single day with her own coffee and a calm that I came to rely on like a fixed point. By year 4, Fenberg had been featured in 2 national home design publications and a segment on a CBC lifestyle program about independent Canadian makers. The piece called my work deceptively functional pattern design that understands how it will actually be used in a room. I gave one interview and spent most of it talking about the process. I redirected every personal question back to the work, not a strategy, but because it was the honest answer. The work was what I had. My father knew eventually. These things travel. Colin sent me a text message about 3 years after I'd left Sudbury. It said, "Saw the CBC thing. Dad watched it twice. Good for you." That was the whole message. I replied, "Thanks for letting me know." And I went back to work. 8 weeks ago, a man named Douglas Fay walked into my studio on a Tuesday afternoon. He wore a pressed flannel shirt and carried a leather portfolio, the kind of person who takes casual seriously. He introduced himself as the Creative Partnerships Director for Northgate Living, a Canadian home furnishings company with 46 retail locations across Ontario, BC, and Alberta. They sold the kind of furniture that sits in the mid-premium range, serious enough to last, accessible enough to actually sell. Their buyers had been looking for a Canadian textile designer to anchor a new in-house collection. Their lead buyer had found Fenbrook through the CBC piece and had spent 2 weeks reviewing my archive before bringing the idea internally. Douglas set a proposal on my drafting table. Northgate wanted a 3-year exclusive product licensing agreement for a Fenbrook signature collection. Upholstery fabrics, cushion covers, table linens, and bedding. The contract value was $640,000 over the term, with royalty structures tied to unit sales above a baseline threshold. They wanted my name on the collection. They wanted the story. They wanted me visible. I read the proposal twice. I asked Douglas for 72 hours to review it with my lawyer. He told me to take a week. He bought 2 Fenbrook art prints before he left. That evening, I was at my drafting table working through notes for my lawyer when my phone rang. Ontario area code I didn't recognize. I answered. My father did not begin with hello. He said my name, and then he said he was calling because he had heard through some people he knew in the manufacturing sector that I had a significant contract offer on the table. He said it the way he'd say the weather was changing, a fact he was simply acknowledging. He told me Whitfield Mechanical had been going through a difficult period. The commercial HVAC market had contracted. 2 of their largest institutional maintenance contracts, a regional hospital network and a school board facility management agreement, had come up for renewal and been consolidated by a third-party property manager who brought their mechanical services in-house. Colin was managing the operational side, but the revenue gap was significant, and the company was carrying debt it hadn't had to carry in 15 years. His proposal was clean and direct. He wanted me to bring Fenbrook into a partnership with Whitfield Mechanical. Not a subsidiary, exactly, but a shared business structure where the Whitfield name and his existing network of commercial and institutional contacts would support Fenbrook's expansion into contract furnishing for commercial spaces, healthcare waiting rooms, office interiors, hotel lobbies. He said the Whitfield name still opened doors in Northern Ontario and parts of the Ottawa Valley. He said it was the logical move. He used the word leverage. He said family businesses should consolidate strength when they had the opportunity. In exchange, he wanted 40% of Fenbrook. I listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. I told him I would think about it. I needed 24 hours to make sure my answer came from clarity rather than the 16-year-old girl who stood in that kitchen and watched her drawings go into the recycling bin. The following morning, I drove to Cootie's Paradise, the marsh on the western edge of Hamilton Harbor that I go to when I need to think. I walked the trail along the water until the city noise dropped behind me, and there was just the sound of the marsh and the early spring birds coming back. I sat on a bench and looked at the water. I thought about Bet's $11,000 and the word Rowanol. I thought about Colin standing in the kitchen doorway that Sunday night, watching everything and saying nothing. I thought about $87 on Etsy, about Iris arriving every morning with her own coffee. I drove back to the studio. I called my lawyer. I signed the Northgate agreement that afternoon. I called my father that evening. I told him I was declining his proposal. I told him I understood the company was navigating a genuinely hard period and that I hoped they found a path through it. I told him I had no interest in a long conflict. I had enough to think about. And then I told him the truth. I told him that on a Sunday evening, about 11 years ago, he put 6 drawings of mine into the kitchen recycling bin and told me I was making a sentimental mistake. I told him I understood now that he believed that. He thought he was protecting me from a path that didn't make sense to him, from risk he couldn't quantify and a future he couldn't blueprint. I understood the logic of it, even if I couldn't live inside it. But the path was mine to walk. The difficulty was the whole point of walking it. The work I built in a studio with drafty windows and uneven floors, the work I started on a drafting table I carried home on the TTC in 2 trips. That wasn't a sentimental mistake. It was the reason Iris shows up every morning and the reason a national retailer flew their creative director to Hamilton on a Tuesday to put a $600,000 proposal on my table. It was built on my grandmother's faith and my own stubbornness and the specific, unrepeatable knowledge that comes from doing a thing alone until you understand it completely. I told him I wasn't interested in the Whitfield name anymore. I had one. It was Fenbrook. It was already on the collection. There was a long quiet on the line. My father said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him before, lower, less structured, that my grandmother always said I was the one who would figure it out on my own. He said she was never wrong about people. I told him she wasn't. I said goodbye. I wasn't cold. I wasn't warm either. I was just someone who had somewhere else to be. The Northgate collection launched 8 weeks after signing. It rolled out to 12 locations in the first wave. By the end of the first quarter, all 46 stores were carrying the Fenbrook line. I brought Iris on full-time and gave her the title she'd earned: Studio Operations Manager. We hired 2 additional fulfillment staff. I expanded into a larger unit on the same block, one with floors that were actually level. On my drafting table, between my sketchbooks and a jar of pencils that need sharpening, sits my grandmother's old film camera. I haven't used it in a while. The roll inside has been there since the day I photographed myself outside the OCAD building in my graduation gown. I keep meaning to finish the roll. I think I'll know when the right moment is. Bet taught me something I didn't have words for when she was alive. She taught me by saving $11,000 over 8 years without telling anyone. She taught me by writing a card that said go and meaning it with every word. She taught me that the people who believe in you before you've proven anything are giving you the most expensive gift there is. They're spending their faith before the return is guaranteed. My father built something real and lasting from nothing, and I will never stop understanding what that cost him. But he made the mistake of thinking that what he had built was the lesson. It wasn't. The lesson was the building itself. The lesson was, pick up your tools, find your materials, and make something that didn't exist before you showed up. He threw my drawings away and called it protection. I picked up a pencil and started over. The collection is called Fenbrook. It's in 46 stores. It has my grandmother's creek in its name and my name on every tag. Nobody put me here. Nobody handed it to me. Nobody can take it either because I am not a subsidiary. I am not a subsidiary. I am the foundation. And foundations don't negotiate with people who once threw their work away. If someone has ever told you that what you make is a hobby, that you're choosing sentiment over sense, that you're walking away from something real, I want you to hear this clearly. What you build with your own hands, in your own drafting hours, from your own specific and unrepeatable understanding of the world, that is the most real thing there is. There is no legacy worth inheriting that you didn't help build. Keep drawing. The work always finds its room. I still think about that Sunday evening sometimes, not with bitterness, something quieter than that, more like the way you think about a storm that passed through and reshaped the landscape permanently, and you've lived in the new landscape long enough that you almost forget what it looked like before. My father is not a bad man. That's the part that took me a long time to sit with, honestly. He built something real in Sudbury with his hands and his judgment, and he genuinely believed that offering me a place inside it was an act of love. The problem wasn't his intention. The problem was that he confused protection with decision-making on someone else's behalf. He looked at my drawings and saw risk. I looked at them and saw the only work that made me feel fully awake. We were both telling the truth. We just weren't speaking the same language. What I understand now, and couldn't have articulated at 18, standing in that kitchen, is that the outcomes in our lives tend to follow directly from the choices we're willing to make when no one is watching and no one is gotching and no one is going to reward us for it. That didn't save $11,000 over 8 years because she expected recognition. She did it because she understood something about who I was before I understood it myself, and she acted on that understanding quietly, consistently, without asking for anything in return. That kind of integrity, the kind that operates the same way whether or not anyone ever finds out, is the thing I try to measure myself against. Not perfectly, but consistently. The intelligence piece took longer to earn. I don't mean book knowledge or technical skill, though those matter. I mean the harder thing, learning to tell the difference between a decision made from clarity and a decision made from old pain. When my father called about the 40%, I genuinely needed that 24-hour pause. I needed to drive to Cootie's Paradise and sit with the question long enough to know I wasn't just reacting. The answer was the same either way, but the quality of the answer was different when it came from a still place rather than a wounded one. I've found that the ability to pause, to actually think before responding when something hits an old nerve, is one of the most quietly powerful things a person can develop. And then there's the part about staying in it. Iris comes in every morning. She's been doing that for years now. She didn't show up for a paycheck. She showed up because she believed in what we were building, before it was the obvious choice to believe in. That kind of commitment, the willingness to keep showing up when the outcome isn't guaranteed, is what separates the things that survive from the things that don't. I thought about that a lot during the lean Octobers in Hamilton, when the invoices were slow and the studio was cold, and it would have been very easy to tell myself I had proven enough. I hadn't. And I knew it. so I kept drawing. The collection is in 46 stores. My grandmother's name is in its bones, even if it's not on the label. My father watched the CBC piece twice, apparently. I don't know what he felt. I hope it was something honest. Build from what you actually know. Act with integrity even when no one's keeping score, and stay in the work long enough for the work to become something real. That's all it ever was.